Well, I think we should get started. I certainly am anxious to hear Grant. So I'm Andy Gordon. I'm with the Let's Talk Science Committee. And I think I have to tell you which committee because there are any number of committees Grant could be presenting for. Any of the art committees, secular humanists. I'm hoping to get him to sing with the OK Chorale sometime. I don't know whether we'll be able to arrange that. But his work is relevant to so much because he's done so much that's important. We're asking him to focus on the science involved in the aesthetics of architecture. He's written a book that has much relevant content, translated into many foreign languages. We're just fortunate to have him here to speak to us about all of his wonderful work. Grant.
Well, I hope I can live up to that introduction. We'll give it a try. You set a challenge. We, in the aesthetics of our world, we tend often, of course, to do representations of ourselves. One of the things that obviously we like to do, Rodin's Burghers of Calais. This is familiar to many of you. Beautiful work. And we use this ourselves, our own figure, sometimes as an element of our architecture, as here. The portals, this happens to be Chartres, the portals of Chartres, and my friends who usher us into the building. We use our own selves as elements of the aesthetic of our surroundings, but that, of course, is obvious and is fairly lightweight. In 1978, I attended a lecture in I think it was the art school at the university, by J. Appleton. Appleton had done a book entitled The Experience of Landscape, of which his lecture was an encapsulation, that I found absolutely arresting. It changed my life. Appleton argued that in landscapes that we like, and in landscape paintings that we choose and buy, that are reproduced as prints and sold, value attached to them, have certain repetitive general characteristics, and he identified these as places of deep shadow and containment, as here on the right side of this image, and open space, sunlit beyond, as in the left side, and water. He called these refuge, the shady bit on the right, and prospect, the open space to the left, and of course the water is water. And Appleton pointed out that these, had they been selected for pleasure eons ago, would have been selected for, because they offered a survival advantage to those who chose them. And he argued that they were chosen for the pleasure, the appeal that they held, as did much of our behaviors. One person said, lust is our way of perpetuating our species, whether we have kids in mind or not. Here, Appleton argued that those who chose other settings yielded less advantage to their subsequent generations, and over the eons, evolution selected for those who chose this kind of setting. Therefore, he proposed that there is a relationship between survival advantage conditions and our chosen aesthetic appeal, the conditions we find aesthetically appealing. I found this an exciting idea. I thought at the time that it cut completely the separation between art and science. I'm less sure now that I would call it science. I don't know quite whether the evolutionary advantageous conditions are called scientific, but it certainly lodged aesthetics in a describable and specific set of conditions. And this excited me. Appleton, I came to know him personally. We met on more than one occasion, and he was here as Dan's lecturer for the university after I had invented a course to deal with this point of view. Gordon Orions, who I think may be here today, was also a part of that. He co-taught with me on several occasions. Well, this then is the condition that that Appleton describes, and I'm showing you here repeated photographs and paintings of that. Here the refuge is on your left with the broad sunlit meadow ahead of us, or here, this is rather a nice one, I think, where the man-made refuge, if you like, the building, is at the edges of the natural refuge, the deep, almost impervious wood that lies behind it. Forward of it, the broad sunlit area, and of course the water. So the refuge is a place to hide from predators, to gain the refuge. And forward of it, the foraging and hunting ground for small game, perhaps, berries and nuts, and the river for water that we must have. I have some here, and fish. But it seemed to me that this was not of a whole lot of help to us in our lives because we spend our time in buildings. We don't really feel, very few of us live in a natural setting like this. It simply is not the way that people exist. We are born in buildings, we learn in them, we give lectures to friends in them. They are where we exist. And I thought, therefore, that if one was to use these realizations, it would be very helpful to see how they might apply to buildings. And actually, Appleton, in his revised edition of his book, gives me credit for having been the pioneer in taking this quite far in terms of its architectural importance. How in architecture? I began with Frank Lloyd Wright's houses. Why? It was partly an innate sort of thing. It felt as though they might correspond to this kind of pattern. It seemed innately right to me. I knew his buildings fairly well. But also, Wright's houses help us to narrow the variables because there are a lot of reasons why we shouldn't like them. The roofs leak, they come in drastically over budget. Johnson's wax, Wright said to Hib Johnson, would cost about $250,000. The bids came in at $12 million. And the same is true of his houses. They are expensive. They have minuscule kitchens, little storage space. There are many reasons why one shouldn't like them, and yet their owners love them. They are some of the most avidly loved residences ever created. And therefore, it seemed to me that if we looked for reasons why they were so dear to those who owned them, we might look at Appleton's idea. This is Wright's Cheney House of 1904. And the first thing I would note for you is that, like that little building we just saw previously, it sits at the edge of a heavily forested background. It is, if you move beyond it, you are in a natural refuge of dense wood, while forward of it there are relatively few trees and bushes. And this is not just a feature of the drawing. This is how Wright intended these buildings to have their plantings organized. Furthermore, as a refuge, how do you get in? Typically, houses present their front door. Here, there is no such thing, and you cannot, in fact, see any entrance at all. If you want to say that a refuge is a secret place, this is a secret place. How do you get in? Way lower right, there's a little stairway. You follow that straight back toward the dense wood, and when you almost get there, you turn left. Having traversed a little walkway, you turn left again, and then right, and then through the door, and you enter then near that fireplace mass. You enter a low ceilinged space. I'd like to show you slides, but somehow my resources on the web have disappeared, so I'm going to have to use words. You come in near that fireplace mass that's marked by the chimney in a low ceilinged space with opaque walls. It's an interior refuge, I've called it, and forward of it, the ceiling rises, and you're looking toward that row of glass doors that lead you out to that terrace. You move from interior refuge to an interior prospect to a real prospect of the terrace itself and the sidewalk and the town beyond. This, then, I would argue, has the innate appeal that Appleton would argue for his landscapes. This is Wright's own Taliesin in central Wisconsin. Again, where's the door? You can't find it. You can't find it. It is over, actually, way over to the left beyond that little row of bushes. You wander in there, and eventually you find the door and enter into a low space with the fireplace, and beyond a great sweep of windows that looks out to Wright's native valley. So I think that one could argue that this is one of the features that has made Wright's buildings so loved. It's not a condition that is unique to Wright. This is Jorn Utzon's Canlis in the Mallorca, in which this semicircular sofa is back in the shadowed part of the room with the fire on the right, and beyond is the more brightly lit prospect, I would argue, looking out to the grand prospect of the island's shore. Wendell Lovett, our local architect of considerable reputation, used this same device without reference to Appleton. He invented it on his own, I think, and he called it the cave in the meadow. And he designed many of his houses with low spaces that were contiguous to high, more brightly lit volumes. I'm not sure he did it as successfully as Wright. That would take some doing, but Wendell did use that. I talked to him at great length about his cave meadow idea, and I think he was sensitive, perceptive in using those features. So much for prospect and refuge. Here we confront a street scene in which we look around a bend to something that we don't know that lies beyond. Stephen and Rachel Kaplan at the University of Michigan probed this feature as an extension, perhaps, of the prospect refuge idea. This is what they called mystery. I've called enticement. Why is it of any survival advantage value? It leads us to exploring, doesn't it? We explore, and in exploring, we find out more about what our environment is. Is there a saber-toothed tiger around the bend? Worth finding out. Is there some delight, a basket of cookies? That would be nice to know too. And so this is a feature that is, I think you'd agree, works for most of us. We are we are invited to follow that street. I suspect most of you here, placed where this photo is taken, would move on, would explore, would find out more. There's a key condition here, though. It has to be moving toward the light. If that around the bend is in the darkness, that's a feature of horror movies. And so the light condition here is crucial. There's something in the distance. Is there anyone here who would not move forward and see what it is? So we move, we follow the bend, and we get our cookie, we get our reward. I'm going to be talking more about this feature a little later in our discussion. But this is the trail that disappears around a bend that leads us onward that I call enticement. There is one rather interesting example. Oh, this, I've forgotten that I included this. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Hannah House, in which he explores the trail that disappears around a bend. The plan here, the central feature is the fireplace, as so often with Wright, but instead of folding the space so it pockets the fireplace, he uses it to bend the spaces backward so that there is the trail here again that disappears around the bend. It's not entirely easy to see here, but if you look at the ceiling, you can see the point. The space wanders back around the fireplace, and it is a fascinating interior for, I think, that reason. On the left is our looking out to the prospect of the brightly lit space through that range of glass. This one is an interesting permutation of the enticement idea. Here we get the cookie, but it's not the cookie we thought we were going to get. This is Cranbrook, the private school and academy north of Detroit in Bloomfield Hills by Elio and Eros Saarinen. It's a beautiful thing. If you go through this gate and wander off to the right, and again I'm going to have to use words, not pictures. If you wander off to the right, you eventually come to an archway, a short tunnel that looks out toward a dense wood. And you think that if you follow it, that's what you're going to get. You're going to move into that dense wood of refuge, and you move forward with that expectation. You get to the balcony sort of platform that lies at the end of that arch, and you find that you're not looking at a dense wood at all. You're looking at this. By Carl Millis, the ponds that lead toward the museum at Cranbrook. Totally different thing. It's a reward, no question of that, but it's not at all what you expected. And I find this a rather interesting permutation of the idea. Millis's sculptures that are the fountains that serve the pool. And Europa and the Bull, one of the more X-rated, I think, of wonderful sculptures. I love it. Look at the musculature of that beast, and just the quarter of an inch that separates Europa's hand from the tongue. Marvelous piece. This, believe it or not, is in England, in the Lake District. This is the Napes Needle. And what are those two people doing up there? Why are they there? The prospect, of course, is tremendous, but you know that that's not really why they're there. They're there for the thrill of it, aren't they? And thrill is an interesting word in that it combines typically both pleasure and fear. It's an edgy word. And they are up there for the thrill of it. They've climbed that to do it. what is this survival advantageous feature of that? I mean, if they one step forward and they're done for. It tests our limits. It tests how much we can do. It tests the limits of our courage in facing danger. And we build buildings that exist for the thrill of it. Here's one, you know this very well. But at the top of this, it's a thrilling experience, I think you'd agree. And you all know what's coming next, don't you? You know what's coming next. Yeah. Built as a thrilling experience, and it is that. But you say, we don't live in these experiences. These are just one-off structures. This isn't a habitation or an office building. But I think the idea of the balcony is a way of utilizing this thrill idea within our buildings. This is a balcony off the condominium that Miriam and I enjoyed before we moved here, and there's a bit of thrill in it, although it's not really high enough to test our courage to that extent. But this, the Northern Life Tower, Seattle Tower in Seattle, obviously, is an example of the use of balconies to generate the possibility of thrill from office spaces. And it seems to me that their value is there whether you use them or not. It's the ability to use them that counts, I think. It's an opportunity for a thrilling experience that we can take or leave, but it's there for our taking. This is a remarkable building in that sense. I don't think there is any building that I know of that takes so profuse advantage of this idea. This building, by the way, some of you may not know, is a tour de force of brickwork. It's dark at the base and light at the top. The bricks have been very carefully graduated to lighten as they ascend, and the control of the brickwork to achieve that end is absolutely astonishing. It was intended, I think, to somehow suggest Mount Rainier, the snow-covered top of Mount Rainier, and it's Paul Goldberg called it, I think rightly, the best of our tall buildings. It's a lovely space. Do you know the lobby? If you haven't gone into the lobby of this building, you really should. It's unmodified, and it's a gorgeous little Art Deco space. Now this. You come into this room today, and you immediately know the human beings that occupy it. You can tell them from the chairs and tables. You order this space immediately, intuitively, with no prompting whatsoever. We order the environment around us. We can hardly manage if we don't. But within that ordering, you also perceive fine differences. You identify friend from stranger very quickly. You identify whether that friend is mad at you or happy to see you. If it's your child, you know whether it's happy or not, and you know whose child it is. I once commented that chickens know their chicks, although we can't tell them apart, they can, stupid though they may seem. We look at the world around us with ordering and fine perception. That's how we function. And we create, I would suggest, characteristics that exploit this part of us. Complex order. We create sound that has complex order. If you have sound that's just order, it's the car alarm. If you have sound that is only complexity, you have noise. But you put them together, order and complexity, and you have Dvorak's cello concerto. So complexly ordered sound has been a feature of every culture we know. It is known to every culture we have any notion of whatsoever. And I suspect everyone in this room values complexly ordered sound. Yours may not be my choice, but we all value that. We value complexly ordered human movement. We call it dance. And we appreciate and are drawn to complexly ordered environments. This is Paul Kirk's Magnolia Library. Is it complex order? You see the point I'm making without my drawing it out, I think. But let's talk about it for a minute. The beams are doubled right the way through. Why? Well, it makes them more delicate for one thing. It also gives a bit of complexity to the rhythm of the bass. A, B, A, B, A, B. And they're connected in the foreground by a vertical to doubled beams below. Up on the roof, the doubled beams create a box that is a skylight. Complex order. Do we find it beautiful? I do. I think it's a beautiful building. And it's a play on exactly that. Its architect probably would not say so, but it's innate, I think, in much of architecture. The architect is almost given the order, the chance at the order at least, in structure and the necessary features of interior space. The trick is to recognize it and then play with it and make it complex, to make it not just an order of simplicity, but to give it a richness of complexity. Here's one. Is this order? You see it at once, and you see the complexity of it, and I would suggest that deep down at the core of things, that's why you like it. Complex order. This feature, I think, is one of my invention, and it's one that I put a good bit of, I attach a good bit of value to it. I'm rather proud of this idea. This is Exeter Cathedral. Order. There are the shafts that make up those piers that establish a rhythm that above becomes the ribs of those arches that divide the side aisles from the main space. Then it moves upward and becomes those ribs that are the vaulting. Do you find this beautiful? I do. I find this a gorgeous building. I love it. I've begun to think it's my favorite of all the cathedrals. This is Ely, the crossing at Ely. Complex order? Yes, indeed. The cloisters at Gloucester. And here the designer has dealt with the surface of the fan as complexity. He begins at the base with that simple little shape that's arched at the top. Then he doubles that, and then 4 of them, and then 8 of them to complete the fan. He nature abhors a vacuum. This designer abhors an uncomplex form, surface. This some of you may know. How many of you have been here? Cambridge, the chapel of King's College. Order, complexity. You might look at this for a minute. It's note the way that the radial and circumferential lines intersect at the junction between the fans, beautifully integrated, coordinated. This is John Wastel at King's College Chapel, the fan vaulting. There's no prospect and refuge here, and there's no enticement. There's certainly no peril. This is complex order, pure and simple, but it yields, for me, a wonderful beauty. Now, this is my last image. I've gone through the material I wanted to talk to you about. This is an odd painting. It's called The Architect's Dream. And the architect is perched there on top of the column. You see him there? He's lounging, little tiny figure on top of that column. I don't know how he got there. But he is at the edges, again, of a refuge. You see over to the left the dark zone of trees and the spired building, and off to the right is a curtain that's about to fall to close off his refuge if he chooses to take advantage of it. So he sits at the edge of a refuge, and he looks out to a prospect, doesn't he, with water. And he looks to objects of complex order that have the inference, perhaps, of thrill in their height and scale. So it's kind of a stupid painting, but it's one that I thought in a rather humorous way encapsulated what I've tried to describe to you as perhaps the quasi-scientific basis of our aesthetic, our architectural aesthetic. I find it useful in my thinking and in design. I hope you find it useful in your appreciation of architecture. I'm glad to discuss this at any length. I've finished rather early on. I hope I've explained it to your reasonable understanding, and I'm glad to talk about it at further length. Andy, your people. Yeah.
So we have a couple of people with mics, and we'd love to have some questions.
There's one.
Just a second. One coming to you, I think. Jack, we have a...
I have a question, is how many or what percentage or do you think that the rules that you find pleasing were created intentionally, and how many and how much of that
Is simply
was
intuition or happenstance? Is that your point?
happenstance or just as a natural feeling that without any
I think it's innate. I think it's intuitive. I don't think that any of the buildings I've shown you were designed by an architect who said, I'm going to create a complexly ordered construction. No, I think it happens. I'm trying to bring it to a conscious level because I think it can aid the architect in design. It isn't a set of rules. My work has been criticized as being a kind of color in between the lines sort of thing, but it's not. It's a basis for judgment. If I were doing a house, I would think about the refuge characteristics and the prospect, but it would be a basis for judgment. And so for me and for, I think, students that I've talked with about it who have found it useful as a device. But it's not a set of rules. And your question, I don't think it has been consciously a consideration to this point. But rules are not inhibiting. Music is an art form that has a whole set of very rigid rules. You don't break them, but it has not at all inhibited creativity. And I think the things I'm talking about here today are not an inhibition to creativity. I'd hope they would release a more appealing creativity in our surroundings. That's my hope. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
No. Yes? No. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
That's right.
When you talked about music also having this, the first thing I thought of is an Indian raga, which has a very rigid structure, actually.
Yeah.
But within it, you get this real complexity of rhythm. And if you go to an Indian concert, and there are a lot of Indian people there that understand the complexity of the rhythm, you can get much more appreciation by watching them respond to the complex rhythm. But it's based on a real structure.
It is, again, order and complexity, is it not? Yes. We had a hand up over here, far way over the wall. Yeah.
Through the centuries, how did the style of soaring arches and brilliance spread? Where did it begin?
It comes oddly enough from the Colosseum. That's the first instance of a vault, which is an arch projected in dimension, of a vault intersected by another vault to make what we call a groin vault. That was developed as the Gothic began in France, actually at the Abbey of Saint Denis in 1144. We have a specific date for it, which is unusual in architectural history. It began there, and its value was seen almost immediately. When that building was completed, its abbot, Suger, invited every bishop in France and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that style spread almost immediately because it allowed the creation of high vaulted spaces which made possible the colored light that you know. It spread to England through a Frenchman who went to Canterbury to do the choir. And then England found rather its own direction. You don't find something like Exeter in France, and I'm becoming increasingly attracted to the British Gothic. Where am I headed? What? How can I answer this better? There is an interesting, as long as we're talking about that, there's an interesting alliance between music and architecture. The groin vault and the Gothic came from the Roman origin, as I've just described it, and it spread eastward and upward. And where it happened, where the Roman influence of large vaulted spaces happened, we have polyphonic music. Where it didn't happen, where the Roman Empire reached its edge, we don't have polyphonic music. And I think it's because these high vaulted spaces held the note. And they made, in a sense, an automatic polyphonic sound. You do da 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 dum bum. And by the time I'm at the end of that, the early notes are retained in these masonry spaces. And there is, I think, a very close alliance between the development of polyphonic music and the influence of the Roman Empire in architectural space. There, I'm done. Next question. Did that help? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. All right. All right.
I just loved what you've just done for us here. It's just fantastic. But there is one aspect that I was surprised.
Repeat what you just.
I said I really appreciated and loved what Grant has done for us here today. It's such an unusual way of having us look at architecture, and but there was one. I thought I have a brother. He's not alive, but was an architect, and I thought that one of the provinces of architecture that made them really special people was they took seriously what did the person ordering the thing want? How was it to be used? And that's clearly evident in all of these large structures, that they wanted a structure that was awe-inspiring, that took you out of your ordinary state of consciousness and to something that you didn't quite know, and were therefore perhaps susceptible to alternative. But you haven't mentioned anything about the person or the organization coming requesting such a structure, whether it was the houses of.
No, I haven't. No. Motivation is an interesting and complicated issue. These buildings, the Gothic cathedrals, the cathedrals anyway, were built for many different reasons. There was an element of politics in them in some cases. There was an economic, Chartres was a tourist center, and without its cathedral, its economy would have plummeted. And so partly there is an economic purpose. We know also at Chartres, I'll tell you the story of that since we have a little time. Chartres burned in 1194, and it was thought, and it held the tunic that supposedly Mary wore at the birth of Christ. Now, how that got saved is anybody's guess, but supposedly it was there, and it was a tourist attraction. It was one of the bases of their economy that people would come to see the tunic. And the fire, it was thought, burned the tunic, and it was thought that Mary wanted to leave the city and have no more cathedral there. 3 days after the fire, the tunic was found, or if you're a skeptic, they stitched one up. But in any event, it was thought to be found, and the message was that Mary did not want to leave the city, but wanted a more beautiful home. Now, you can mix up a bunch of motivations there, you see immediately. So the why of these buildings is, the motivation is often complicated, but your basic point, I think, that these were built to inspire and be awesome, I think is quite true. It's clear that that was something going on. The sheer craft of these is astonishing. I mean, how do you make them?
What do you think of the idea that architecture is frozen music?
Oh, I think music is thought architecture. Next question.
But
I'm
But
sorry.
I can't accept the idea that architecture is frozen. I think architecture is a kinetic art because it invites movement in your eyes. The people moving through it. Every piece of architecture of merit it draws you through it.
You make a wonderful point. I teach architecture as experience, not as object. Well, I teach in many ways, of course, but experience to me is a very important aspect of the architectural understanding. And you raise a very good point indeed, Henry. Thank you much. Yes, experience. You move through the spaces, you experience them, and that's how we love them. Yes, good for you. Yeah, yes, I
just want to emphasize that music is so.
hang on.
Grant, I have the mic hot now. Grant,
Yeah.
one of the things I like about your lectures more than any others we ever hear is they always get us thinking. We don't leave here without thinking in a lecture, in your presentation by you. So thank you for that. And one thought that came to me when you were talking about the combination of architecture, music, and the ordering and so on, there's a real life problem going on, not a problem, but an issue going on now in terms of remodeling a very significant religious space in Seattle. And they have a marvelous organ. Not very many people really like organ music anymore, but they sure like looking at the order of the pipes.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Interesting point. Yeah, Peter, you wanted to say.
I just want to emphasize how music depends so much on time,
Yes.
and pure space doesn't get. Without time, you don't get rhythm, you don't get music, and so this is. I just want to emphasize the time.
Music.
St. Augustine said, "We all know what time means until we try and think about it."
Music, a melody occurs only in our head. The sound that impinges on our ear is there for a moment and moves on. And we retain the memory of the melody. On the day I was born, by the time I get to born, the other sounds have vanished, but you hear it as a line of melody and words because it's in here. That's the only place it is. Yeah.
Peter, I took pipe organ in college, and afterwards I wanted to be a church organist. It's a beautiful instrument.
Yeah.
Grant, in the middle here.
Yeah.
What architecture schools did those designers go to? And who financed the designing and the building and keeping up? Those people putting their nickels and dimes in the church plate didn't support that.
These buildings, the one that's on the slide now, existed in a world in which capital had far fewer destinies. We now use our capital to build aircraft carriers and interstate highways and new towers for retirement homes. Our capital has many destinations. It had relatively few in this world. There were no such things as what I've just mentioned, and it found its way into buildings. This became the destination of capital in a far greater degree than is possible now. But now I've forgotten what you asked me. Oh, repeat again, Joan, what was your question?
What architecture school
these buildings were designed, worked out in lodges that were schools. The mason, for up until really the 19th century, would have spent 7 years in apprenticeship learning geometry, reading and writing, trigonometry, many things. Then they emerged from the lodges as educated people, men, I might as well say. They were educated men. Before they picked up a trowel and laid a stone. Those were the schools, and they were good ones. They trained to do these things. Yeah.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
See if I can do this. Grant, think of complexity and order, which I see there in all of your slides, have been magnificent, of course. And it represents history and hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Where is complexity and order in contemporary architecture? You showed Paul Kirk's piece, which is
Yeah,
some,
yeah.
but where we try for more simplistic spaces
yeah.
and all, where do you see that fitting?
Have you been to our library?
Our
Downtown?
library, oh, you mean here?
The downtown library by
The
Coolhouse?
downtown library, yeah.
Yeah. I could cite many other examples, and I think you could as well. And while I mentioned the tower, and you kind of laughed about it, and my position is that I regret that it has to happen. I'm not a proponent of it, but that decision is made, that ship has sailed, and if we're going to have a tower, this is going to be a really fine one. The design is first rate, and it's a complex order of considerable talent and elegance, I think. So it'll be a good building, a very good building indeed. You're looking for other. I would. Yeah, I've written books about George Tsuyama's work and Gordon Walker's, and they describe buildings of wonderful complex order that are contemporary. This was my first love, and it shows. But I'm not purely a historian by any means.
Grant,
Yes.
I see your
What?
concepts of order and complexity. Here I am.
Where?
Grant,
Way over
Here.
somewhere. There you are. Okay. Hi.
I see the concepts of order and complexity very clearly in architecture and all that you have shown. And I've been interested in the comments that have been made about music, but I guess I don't see order and complexity as clearly in music as I do in architecture.
Oh, do you not?
Music from
Oh.
Bach to Beethoven
Yeah.
has a lot of order and complexity.
Yeah.
But Debussy, for example, in La Mer, I see complexity, but I don't see that much order, and it's intentional.
You don't see that much order in what?
In Claude Debussy's
Oh.
La Mer, and I could give other
Oh.
examples too. And I
Yeah.
just wonder what you think about that.
Well, I think you're focusing on the richness of the complexity of these creations, and I agree with you. And I don't know how on earth composition can happen. I mentioned Dvorak's cello concerto. It's a lovely piece, but to imagine the writing of it, the complexity of its writing, to me remains an almost impossible creation. It baffles me that the human mind can do that, but the order is clearly there nevertheless. You don't find dissonance, you don't find conflicting or dissonant elements within it. It is nevertheless an ordered composition, I would argue, although it's the richness of the complexity in which we find the beauty, I would say. Yes.
Grant, hi,
Yeah.
Peter again.
Yeah.
Over here on your left.
Yeah.
I invite you to comment on the order and complexity of the space that we're in right now.
Oh, do you?
I do. You can decline the invitation, of
Yeah,
course.
I have another appointment coming up. Well, the ceiling is an example. It was completely redone, and I would say that the order and the acceptance of the varieties of lighting that it encompasses is perhaps an argument for complexity. But I wouldn't have said exactly either that this is Dvorak's cello concerto.
Grant,
Yes. Yeah.
I think you and I need to get together and maybe put on a program sometime about the complexity of architecture and music and how they do go together. But you have brought up the one thing, Irwin was just touching on some things. Think back to last night, to the complexity of some of the music that was brought here by this saxophonist last night.
Yeah.
With drumming, with
yeah.
complexity of sound,
Yeah.
and things innate from other countries.
Yeah.
Was absolutely stunningly done,
Yeah.
but most people wouldn't have found it very musical. But it was an extremely fine evening, and I think you and I could put together another program having to do with music and architecture and how they all work together, because they are definitely in sync with each other.
I gave a talk on exactly that subject at the University of, or at Indiana University, whose music school is renowned. I gave a talk on that relationship, and I'd be delighted to work with you about that. It intrigues me. The differences and the likenesses are fun to contemplate. Yeah, yeah. And Pietro wants another word here. Yes.
The order and complexity is brought to light when we get to 20th century music, where they sort of gave up on what we think of as a normal harmony, and so they went in for 12-tone music, where the order comes from playing the same notes over and over again, nothing but the same notes over and over and over again, using all 12 notes, but in different time and everything. So that was a case of those composers feeling like normal rhythm and normal harmony had gotten used up.
Yeah.
And I think, and I sympathize with those guys. So much had been done, but anyway, they wanted something new, and so they used the same notes over and over and over and over again, different rhythms, different octaves, and everything.
But in order, nevertheless.
But they're sticking to order. They
Yes,
want
indeed.
order.
Yeah.
They want. And it's,
They changed the order.
No, same order.
Same order. Yeah.
Same notes over and over and over again.
Yeah, but they changed it. They changed it from the 8-note. Yeah, octave. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we could go on forever, and it's not fair to Grant. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Been fun to talk about.